I didn't expect to survive the fire, and I sure as hell didn't expect to feel anything after it. Then one day, he was just there, a stray, limping, watching me like he'd been waiting. No collar, no bark, just golden eyes that saw too much. I tried to ignore him, but he never left. And when I finally let him in, something changed. He didn't just follow commands, he remembered them. He knew things he shouldn't. Did things no ordinary dog would. Turns out he had a past, just like me. They called him a mistake, a failed experiment, a ghost from a program that never existed. But I saw something else. Loyalty, bravery, and pain that matched my own. Then they came to take him back, erase him. But I've already lost one dog to the fire. I won't lose another, not him. He waited for me, when no one else did. And now I'll never leave him behind. It was the kind of morning that wrapped everything in a brittle silence. Frost clung to the edges of cracked windows. The air was still, breathless, like the world was holding something in. Caleb Walker sat on a wooden bench in Miller Park, the same bench he'd claimed every morning for the last 61 days. Always at dawn, always alone. It wasn't a habit, it was a ritual. And rituals mattered when everything else in your life stopped making sense. He wore the same coat every time. Dark green canvas fraying around the cuffs, one pocket stitched with fishing wire. His hands, calloused and raw, were clasped tightly together between his knees. He never brought coffee. He never fed the ducks. He just sat there, eyes fixed on the frozen pond like it might finally say something back. Caleb didn't speak much anymore. Not since the accident. Not since the fire. People in town had stopped trying. They waved when they saw him at the general store or the gas station. But nobody tried to reach him, not really. And he preferred it that way. Silence was honest. It didn't ask for anything. The first time he noticed the dog, it wasn't moving. It sat under a twisted maple tree about 15 feet away. Just sat there watching. Its fur was thick but unkempt. A coat that had once been golden, but now wore the dust and mud of neglect. It had one ear that flopped slightly, and its right leg was bent awkwardly underneath its body. There was no collar, no tags, but its eyes, those eyes, held something Caleb hadn't seen in a long time. Recognition. He shifted slightly on the bench. You lost or just bowled? The dog didn't react, didn't growl or bark, just looked. Caleb turned back toward the pond, trying to ignore the prickling in his chest. It was probably hungry, or cold, or both. But he didn't move, he didn't invite. That wasn't his job anymore. The next day, it was there again, a little closer this time. He considered ignoring it again, but something in its posture made him pause. It wasn't desperate, it wasn't threatening, it was waiting. That was the part that rattled him most. It seemed like the dog had made some kind of choice to be here with him. He stood up, bones creaking in protest, and walked slowly toward it. 5 steps in, the dog stood too, favoring its injured leg but not retreating. Caleb stopped. They stared at each other for a few moments. You're persistent. I'll give you that. Still, no bark, no tail wag. Sobbing, just that same steady gaze. He turned and left without another word. Back home, he couldn't stop thinking about it. He made his usual dinner, canned beans and leftover chicken, and found himself wrapping up a small portion in tinfoil. Out of habit, guilt, something else? He didn't try to name it. The next morning, he brought it with him. When he arrived at the bench, the dog was already there, curled up in the exact spot it had been the day before. Caleb didn't sit right away. He unwrapped the meat and placed it a few feet from the dog, careful not to make sudden movements. There, he muttered. There, nestled in the corner where warmth still clung to the floorboards, was the golden form curled tight, nose tucked under its tail, the blanket he'd given it half draped across its back. For a second, he just watched. The dog's chest rose and fell in an even rhythm, a low hum of breath escaping with each exhale. In the soft blue glow of early morning, it looked almost peaceful. He rubbed the sleep from his face. I must be losing it, he whispered. He hadn't shared space with anyone in years, not even a fish. The idea of something alive, something dependent, coexisting in this house. It made the place feel different, Less like a mausoleum, more like a home. He stood slowly, careful not to make noise, and made his way to the kitchen. The floor creaked under his heel, and the dog stirred but didn't lift its head. From the pantry, he retrieved what was left of last night's chicken and a half loaf of dry bread. He placed the pieces on a plate and filled a metal bowl with water. Setting it all down by the hearth, he stepped back, waiting. The dog opened its eyes, blinking slowly. It sniffed the air, then looked at him. Caleb didn't move. After a long moment, the dog rose on 3 legs and hobbled over. It ate without urgency, pausing between bites to glance up at him. "You keep looking at me like that," Caleb muttered, "like you know something I don't." The dog lapped at the water, then curled back into the same spot, licking its paw tenderly. Caleb watched the limp. It wasn't getting better. If anything, it looked worse this morning, more strained. He'd wrapped sprained ankles before, bandaged cuts, iced joints. He knew what untreated injuries could do to a body over time. But this wasn't a person. This was a stray, a wild thing. You weren't supposed to get involved. That's what everyone always said. Let nature take its course. Let the animal run its own road. He returned to his armchair, sat down slowly, and pulled the flannel tighter around him. But his eyes didn't leave the dog. That evening, after a day spent chopping wood and patching a leak in the roof, Caleb stood over the phone on the wall. His fingers hovered above the dial. Old instincts screamed at him, Don't pull someone else into this. Don't make this official. If you call the vet, you lose control." But that limp, that damn limp. He pulled his hand away and stepped outside instead. Cold air met his face like a slap. Snow had started falling again, light and dry like dust. His breath fogged out in front of him. On the porch, he sat in the creaky rocker and stared into the forest beyond the clearing. Trees stood like sentries in the pale moonlight. Wind rattled the pine branches. Somewhere in the distance, an owl hooted once, and then from behind him came the soft tap of nails on wood. The dog padded out, careful with its bad leg, and sat next to him without hesitation. It didn't beg, didn't nuzzle or lick. It simply sat, shoulder against his boot, as if to say nothing needed to be said. It wasn't easy. The animal was heavier than expected, and clearly in pain. But it didn't resist. It let him lift it, let him set it on the torn blanket spread over the seat. It even let him close the door without trying to bolt. The drive into town was quiet. Caleb kept glancing at the dog. It stared straight ahead, eyes fixed on the snowy road like it had made this trip before. The vet's office was on the edge of town, tucked between a closed-down diner and an abandoned hardware store. Caleb hadn't been there in years, not since Ash. Even now, the memory hit like a punch to the ribs. Dr. Emily Harris still ran the place. She was younger than him by about a decade, sharp-eyed and brisk, always in a hurry but never unkind. When he walked in, the bell above the door jingled, and she looked up from behind the counter. "Well," she said, eyebrows raising, "this is a surprise." Caleb cleared his throat, found a stray. "Hurt pretty bad. Thought you could take a look." She stepped around the desk and approached the dog, who was sitting calmly by the door. "Doesn't look feral," she said, kneeling beside it. "Pretty calm for a stray. Hasn't made a sound since I met it." She gently lifted the injured leg. The dog flinched but didn't pull away. "Swollen. Could be a sprain or fracture." "You said it's been limping for days?" Caleb nodded. "I'll need to do an x-ray to be sure. You want to hang around?" He hesitated. "Yeah, I'll wait." Emily carried the dog into the back room, and Caleb sat in a stiff chair by the window. He stared at the snow outside, watching it melt against the glass. Half an hour later, Emily returned. "No break," she said, "soft tissue injury. Could be an old strain, aggravated by the cold. I wrapped it, gave him something mild for the pain." "Him?" She nodded. "Yup, male, maybe 4 or 5 years old. And get this, he's chipped." Caleb blinked. "So he has an owner?" "Not exactly. The chip is registered to a program, not a person. Firehouse Search and Rescue Initiative. The tag is marked inactive." Caleb stared at her. "What does that mean?" Emily shrugged. "Could mean the dog was in training. Could mean he was retired. Sometimes these programs get shut down and the animals get lost in the shuffle. He felt the air leave his lungs. Can you trace it? Trying to. The system's old. Give me a couple days. He stood, unsure what to do with his hands. How much do I owe you? She smiled. Bring him back in 3 days, that's all I ask. Caleb nodded, reached down to pat the dog gently, and led him back to the truck. As they drove home, his mind spun in loops. A firehouse dog, search and rescue. How had he ended up here on Caleb's porch? Back at the cabin, he laid a fresh blanket by the fire and set out a larger bowl of food. The dog walked slowly, deliberately, and settled in without complaint. When Caleb crouched to check the bandage, the dog let out a small sigh, like gratitude. "You're full of surprises," Caleb whispered. Later that night, he pulled out the worn photo album from the top shelf. Dust clung to the cover. He flipped through it slowly. There it was, a picture from 3 years ago, him in full turnout gear, his partner beside him, and in front of them, a golden retriever wearing a bright red vest. Ash, the dog in the photo, had the same golden coat, same deep eyes, same half-flopped ear. Caleb sat very still. Then, without even thinking, he whispered, "Ash." The dog on the floor lifted its head, ears twitching. It didn't move otherwise, didn't come running or bark in recognition. But for one impossible moment, Caleb could have sworn it held his gaze a second longer than it should have. He closed the album and leaned back, heart thudding. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe it was something more. 3 nights later, the sky broke open with rain. Not the light drizzle that danced on rooftops, but a cold, punishing rain that hit sideways, soaking through coats and splintering off window panes like needles. Caleb sat by the fire, a cup of untouched coffee cradled in both hands, staring at the dog curled in the same spot it had claimed since that first night. He still hadn't named it. Names were commitments. Names made things real. But something about the way the dog lay there, unafraid, trusting, waiting, made it harder each day not to give in. The phone rang. He let it ring twice before crossing the kitchen and lifting the receiver. "Walker," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "Caleb, it's Emily. Got something on that chip." He straightened. "Tell me." Registered to a pilot program run by the State Fire Marshal's office back in 2018. They were testing canine units in rural departments, search and rescue, mostly golden retrievers and labs, breeds known for scenting and gentleness. Your dog, well, the dog, was in the initial batch. Designated unit tag E17. Last recorded handler died in a structural collapse during a training op in western Colorado. Caleb didn't answer right away. His knuckles whitened around the phone cord. After the collapse, Emily continued. Records show the dog bolted, never recovered. Program was shut down the following year. He said nothing. "Caleb," she asked, "you still there? How sure are you? This is the same dog, tags a match. The tech said it's old, but intact." "Honestly, I'm surprised it's still readable. Most strays either lose their chips or they stop working in this kind of cold." Caleb closed his eyes. "What's its name?" he asked quietly. There was a pause. Then the dog was named Ember. The phone buzzed gently in his hand for a moment before he hung it up. Ember. He turned and looked at the dog. It was awake now, watching him with those same golden eyes. The fire flickered shadows across its face. He stepped closer, kneeling just a few feet away. "Ember," he said aloud. The dog's ears twitched. "Is that you?" Ember stood up slowly, limped over, sat in front of him, then very gently placed its paw on his knee. Caleb felt something break open inside him. Not all at once. Not like a wound tearing. It was softer, deeper, like ice cracking at the first thaw. He laid his hand over Ember's paw. "You came back," he whispered. The next morning, Caleb didn't go to the park. He didn't sit on the bench or feed the ducks. Instead, he poured 2 bowls, one for him, one for Ember, and sat cross-legged on the cabin floor while the dog ate. He watched every motion. The way Ember chewed carefully, glanced up often, tail twitching just slightly as if always on alert. This wasn't a regular stray. He'd known it from the beginning. But now, with the name confirmed, the chip identified, and the unmistakable recognition in those eyes, Caleb didn't doubt it anymore. This dog had been trained. He tested it, softly. Search. Ember lifted his head. Caleb pointed to the firewood pile and whispered again, "Search." Ember limped over, sniffed the log, circled once, then looked back at Caleb with a huff. "Not bad," Caleb murmured. Later that afternoon he tried again. "Stay." Ember froze in place. Caleb took a few slow steps away. Ember didn't move. "Come." The dog limped forward immediately, head low, tail wagging once. It shouldn't have surprised him, but it did. He spent hours that day pacing the cabin, memories coming back like waves. The old training yard, the way Ash used to circle debris piles, the sharp barks that signaled a find, the look she gave him when a drill went well, that perfect mix of pride and focus, like she knew exactly what they were doing and why it mattered. But Ember wasn't Ash. Ash had died in a fire that never made the news. They'd been called to a warehouse in the middle of nowhere. Electrical fault, the report said. By the time Caleb and his team arrived, half the building was swallowed in smoke. Ash went in first. She always did, nosing her way through the maze of collapsed beams and steel drums. She barked, once, twice, then silence. Caleb went after her. He didn't remember much after that. Just heat and noise, a beam giving way, and the sensation of flying backward into blackness. They pulled him out 40 minutes later. Ash never made it. That had been the end of everything. Until now. That night Ember wouldn't settle. He paced the cabin in slow, limping circles. His ears perked at every creak, every gust of wind against the windows. At one point he stood by the door and whined, soft, almost mournful. "What is it?" Caleb asked. Ember didn't respond. He stepped outside. The cold slapped his face, but he didn't care. He scanned the trees, the driveway, the woods beyond the clearing. Nothing, but Ember remained at the threshold, sniffing the air, tail stiff. "Are you looking for something?" Caleb whispered. Ember lowered his head. A low growl rumbled in his chest. Not angry, just tense. Nervous. Caleb stepped back in, closed the door and checked the locks. He didn't sleep well that night. By morning, snow had fallen again. Thick, quiet. Caleb brewed coffee, fed Ember, and sat by the fire, flipping through the last few pages of an old beat-up field manual on search and rescue protocols. Most of the ink had faded, but he knew the pages by heart. There was a photo tucked into the back. Him, Ash, and another firefighter, Charlie Griggs, who now lived 2 states away with a new family and no appetite for the past. Caleb stared at that photo for a long time. Then he reached down and scratched behind Ember's ear. I think it's time," he said. That afternoon, he called Emily. "Can you get me in touch with whoever ran that pilot program?" he asked. There was a pause. "Why?" "I think I need to know where Ember came from. The full story. Not just what's in the database." Emily didn't ask more questions. She knew better. "I'll try," she said. "Give me a day or 2. He hung up and turned back to Ember. "You okay with a drive?" The dog tilted its head. Caleb smiled. They didn't leave the cabin that day, but something had shifted. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was filled with unsaid understanding. That evening, not after everything, Ember's eyes slowly closed. But here you are. Outside, the snow fell without a sound. Inside, something long frozen finally began to melt. Snow drifted in lazy spirals outside the cabin windows. But inside, the fire crackled softly and cast a slow-moving warmth across the wooden floor. Ember was asleep again, curled in his usual spot like he'd never lived anywhere else. Caleb sat at the kitchen table, with a pencil in his hand, the edge of a blank envelope under its tip. He wasn't writing a letter. He wasn't sure why he picked up the pencil in the first place, only that something in him felt unfinished. He stared at the dog, and then, without thinking, he wrote a word on the back of the envelope. Ember, a small word, gentle, unassuming, but layered with everything he didn't know how to say aloud. It wasn't just about fire. It was about what remained after, the slow burn, the glow that survived after the flames had gone. The name fit. He walked over to the dog and crouched down. "Ember," he said clearly. The dog's ears perked. Caleb smiled. "Yeah, that's you." He wasn't sure if Ember recognized the name from a former life or was simply responding to the sound of Caleb's voice. Either way, something had changed between them. The distance had shortened. The silence was no longer hollow. It was shared. Later that morning, Caleb decided to test something else. He pulled an old fire department duffel bag from the closet and unzipped it. The scent of smoke still clung to the fabric, faint but stubborn. Inside, among the gear and coiled rope, was a battered red vest, one of the old K9 unit's rescue harnesses. He hadn't touched it since the day Ash died. It had taken him a year just to move it into the closet, even longer to open it. He held the vest up. The word search was still embroidered in faded white across the strap. Ember stood nearby watching. Caleb lowered the vest slowly and extended it toward him. "You wore one of these before, didn't you?" Ember sniffed it. A moment passed. Then, without prompting, he lowered his head and stepped forward. Caleb slid the vest over his back, careful around the bandaged leg. Ember didn't flinch. Once it was secure, he stepped back. "You look like you remember." Outside, the snow had stopped. Caleb decided it was time to move beyond the cabin. They headed out together, Ember trotting at his side, slower than most dogs but steady. Caleb led him to the edge of the woods, then stopped at a cluster of broken branches and drifted leaves. "All right," he said softly. "Search." Ember hesitated, then lowered his nose to the snow. He circled once, then again. Suddenly he barked, sharp, focused, and turned to Caleb, tail straight. Caleb's breath caught that bark. It was the same signal Ash used to give, the unmistakable tone of a find. He walked over and knelt in the snow. Beneath the drift, half buried, was the worn glove Caleb had tucked there as a test. Ember had found it. Caleb exhaled slowly, hand resting on the dog's back. "You really were trained, and not just trained. Good." Back at the cabin, he filled the stove, added logs to the fire, and gave Ember an extra serving of meat with warm broth. He deserved it. That night, as Caleb stood by the window watching the wind pick up again, something on the road caught his eye. A car, headlights, briefly visible through the trees, then gone. Strange. No one drove out here unless they had a reason. His cabin was too remote for joyrides or lost tourists. The road past his house led only deeper into the forest, to old hunting trails or dead ends long forgotten. He stepped out onto the porch, squinting against the blowing snow. Nothing, just the crunch of pine needles and the moan of wind across the hills. Still, he felt it. That tight pull in his chest. The same instinct that used to tug at him right before a fire call. The kind you couldn't explain, only trust. He left the porch light on all night. The next morning was clear and cold. Caleb had just stepped outside with Ember when he saw them. Tracks. Tire marks, faint but present, cutting across the road about 50 feet from the house. Whoever had driven up had turned around. He crouched to examine them, fresh. Less than 24 hours old. Ember stood behind him, tense. Caleb narrowed his eyes. Someone was watching. That night, they didn't sleep in the living room. He moved a cot into the back hallway, away from the windows, and placed Ember's blankets beside it. The wind howled louder than usual, but neither of them stirred. When Caleb opened his eyes in the middle of the night, Ember was awake, alert, ears cocked toward the front door. It wasn't until the following afternoon that the danger arrived. They were hiking along the tree line, where the creek curved through the woods. Caleb had tossed another glove into a low pile of sticks to test Ember's tracking again. But before Ember could respond, a sharp noise cracked through the air. A branch snapped. Not far away, Caleb froze. Then a voice, male, muffled, followed by the crunch of boots. He crouched low. Ember dropped beside him instantly, not making a sound. Two figures emerged between the trees, both in heavy parkas, one carrying what looked like a tranquilizer rifle. Caleb didn't move. The men were talking, but he couldn't hear the words. They were scanning the ground. One pointed toward the stream, the other adjusted his rifle. Hunters? No. Wrong gear, wrong posture. These men weren't after deer. They were tracking something, someone. Caleb felt a cold coil in his stomach. Ember. He reached for the small radio clipped to his belt, something Emily had insisted he keep on him during longer walks. He clicked it twice. A code they'd agreed on. Urgent. Then he whispered to Ember, "Stay." The dog remained still. They backed away slowly, silently, melting into the trees until the cabin came into view. By the time they made it back, Emily was already on her way. She arrived an hour later in her truck, headlights off. She stepped out, bundled in a long coat, her breath fogging in the cold. "I got your signal," she said. "What's going on?" Caleb told her everything. About the car, the tracks, the strangers in the woods. "They had a tranq gun," he said. "They were looking for something." Emily frowned. "You think they were after Ember?" "I don't think," he said. "I know." She ran a hand through her hair. "We need to figure out who wants him and why. I thought that program was shut down. It was officially. But programs like that, they don't just disappear. Someone always keeps the files." She knelt beside Ember, who hadn't left Caleb's side since they returned. "We need to get him someplace safer," she said. "Just for now." "No," Caleb replied, more sharply than he meant to. She looked up. "He stays with me," Caleb said. "He's already lost enough." Emily didn't argue. "All right," she said softly. "Then I'll help you keep him safe." Later that night, Caleb sat by the fire, Ember at his feet, while the wind rattled the shutters. Outside, the forest lay quiet, but the threat lingered in the air, like smoke that wouldn't clear. He scratched behind Ember's ear and murmured, "They don't get you. Not now, not again." Ember pressed closer, tail brushing Caleb's leg. They sat that way for a long time, man and dog, protector and survivor, bound by something older than words and stronger than fear. The wind had settled by morning, but the cold had not. It hung in the air like a warning, sharp and insistent, crawling through every crack in the cabin walls. Caleb stared out the window, one hand loosely gripping a mug of tea gone cold. His mind wasn't in the cabin. It hadn't been since yesterday, since those two men stepped into his woods with rifles and tracking gear like ghosts, from a life he thought was buried in ash. Behind him, Ember lay quiet but alert, eyes flicking to every shadow outside. Emily had left at dawn. She didn't say much, but the tight set of her jaw spoke volumes. She was going to dig into the fire marshal's old records, try to figure out who would be looking for a dog that technically didn't exist anymore. Caleb knew he couldn't sit still. There was a place he hadn't returned to since the day he handed in his badge. A place that still carried echoes of everything he'd lost. The firehouse. By late morning, he packed Ember into the truck and headed south. The building sat on the edge of the old downtown, wedged between a shuttered gas station and an auto parts store that was somehow still open despite having no customers. The red paint on the firehouse had faded to rust, and one of the garage bay doors sagged slightly, like it was tired of pretending it could open. Caleb pulled in and killed the engine. Ember stirred in the passenger seat, looking out the window like he recognized the place, or the silence wrapped around it. Caleb sat for a long time before finally getting out. He hadn't called ahead. He didn't want a welcome or a warning, just answers. Inside, not much had changed. Same cracked tile, the same dusty old bulletin board. A few new faces, younger men and women who glanced at him with the kind of wary curiosity reserved for legends and ghosts. He found Chief Riley in his office, hunched over a stack of paperwork, glasses pushed up on his forehead like always. Riley looked up, surprised but not shocked. Walker Caleb nodded once. "Chief," the old man leaned back slowly. "Didn't expect to see you again. I wouldn't be here if I didn't need to be." Riley gestured to the empty chair. "You look better than you did the day you walked out of here." "I feel worse." Riley didn't smile. "So, what brings you in?" Caleb didn't answer right away. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a printed photo Emily had given him. One taken from the CHIPS registry. It showed a younger Ember, clean and alert, wearing a bright red vest. The unit tag on his collar read E17. Riley went still. "Where'd you get this?" "Found him. Out in the woods. He limped into my life a few weeks ago and hasn't left since." The chief's eyes darkened. "That's impossible. He was chipped. Same ID. Program tag says Fire Marshal's pilot out of Denver, 2018. Riley exhaled, leaned back and rubbed his temples. "We were part of that pilot," he admitted. "They brought 3 dogs in. Ember was one of them. Bright, quiet, took to training like he'd been born for it." "So what happened?" Riley's eyes drifted toward the window. There was a drill out near Boulder, controlled structure collapse, but something went wrong. The building came down too soon. Ember's handler didn't make it. Ember ran, bolted into the forest and never came back. We searched for 2 weeks, never found a trace. Caleb felt something tighten in his chest. "They shut down the program after that," the chief said. "Said it was too dangerous, too costly. The other dogs got reassigned. Ember was written off. You never tried to find him again. We were told not to." The silence between them grew heavy. Caleb broke it. "Someone's looking for him. 2 men. Gear, rifles, tracking dogs of their own. They weren't state officials." Riley's gaze snapped back to him. "You think they're private. I think they're dangerous." Riley stood and crossed the room to a filing cabinet. He pulled out a thick folder and tossed it on the desk. The label read, K9 Project, Echo Unit, Phase 1. He opened it. Inside were scanned ID badges, training logs, psychological evaluations for both dogs and handlers. Caleb flipped through until he found Ember's file. A sticky note had been taped over the original adoption clearance. "Recall designation." "Classified, what the hell does that mean?" Caleb asked. Riley's voice was low. "It means someone higher up didn't want those dogs disappearing." Ember wasn't just trained for rescue. He was part of a behavioral study, loyalty, trauma retention, post-traumatic navigation. He was one of the few dogs who consistently returned to the last person he bonded with. Caleb stared at the photo. "I think he found me because he remembered the system that left him behind. Maybe he recognized something in me." Riley shut the file. "Or maybe he was trying to finish the mission." Caleb narrowed his eyes. "What mission?" Riley hesitated. There were whispers, unofficial talk, that certain units were testing not just rescue training but recon behavior. Dogs that could return to compromised areas and deliver information. Silent retrieval protocols. Ember was the most advanced. "He's a dog," Caleb said. Riley nodded slowly. "And sometimes they're better than us." When Caleb left the firehouse, the folder was tucked under his arm. Ember waited in the truck, watching with quiet intensity. As Caleb climbed in, he met the dog's gaze and whispered, "They didn't deserve you." Ember licked his nose. They drove in silence most of the way home. But as they crested the last ridge, Caleb spotted something that made his pulse spike. Tracks. Fresh tire marks, weaving off the main road and cutting through the snow toward the cabin. He pulled over, heart pounding, and scanned the woods. No movement, but they were being watched. He could feel it. When they reached the cabin, everything looked untouched, but that didn't comfort him. Inside, Caleb set the fire and loaded his shotgun. Ember paced. That night, neither of them slept, and somewhere in the dark beyond the trees, someone waited for the right moment to move. The air was wrong. Caleb felt it the second he stepped outside. The sky was too still, the trees too quiet. It wasn't the natural hush of winter. This silence had weight, like the moment before a fuse ignites. Ember paced the porch, nose twitching, every muscle taut. He moved from the stairs to the edge of the railing and back again, head low, body tight with warning. "Easy," Caleb whispered, though his own chest was tightening. He'd already checked the locks twice. The shotgun leaned near the door. The firewood was stacked high, but it didn't matter. Instinct told him they weren't prepared. Not for this. He looked out over the tree line. Still nothing, and then Ember growled, low, controlled, a sound made to travel only inches. Caleb followed his gaze, movement, a flicker behind the pines, then another. Human silhouettes shifting between the trunks, slow and careful, shadows in the snow. Caleb backed up toward the door. He didn't recognize the men. No uniforms, no headlights, just the silence of practiced steps and heavy boots. He stepped inside and closed the door quietly, locking it with a single twist. Ember stayed by the window. Caleb grabbed the radio. "Emily, if you're out there, come in." 2 men approaching, armed. No insignia, the radio crackled with static. Then, "I'm en route, 10 minutes out, don't engage." He didn't respond, there wasn't time. A knock sounded at the door, calm, deliberate. Caleb froze. Then a voice, deep male with a drawl he didn't recognize. "Mr. Walker, we'd like to talk." He said nothing. "We're here for the dog." Still nothing. The voice continued. "He's not safe with you. You don't know what he is." Caleb stepped forward just behind the door. "I know enough. I know enough. You know the program he came from was shut down. I know he's not yours. He's property of a discontinued federal initiative. That makes him unclaimed government research." "He's not research," Caleb snapped. "He's alive, he's thinking, and he's mine." A pause. "Then we're authorized to retrieve him, one way or another." From the window, Ember let out a warning bark that shook the walls. That was when the glass shattered. Something heavy, metal, came flying through the front window, landing with a crash near the fireplace. A distraction. Caleb ducked instinctively as another impact struck the side wall. The back window cracked, then burst. Gas, thick, burning his eyes. Smoke without fire. Caleb grabbed the shotgun and swung open the cabinet below the sink. A small vent was hidden behind it, an old emergency exit he'd carved himself when he built the place. He dropped to one knee and looked at Ember. "Go." Ember hesitated. "Go." The dog slipped through the hole. Caleb followed, shoving the board aside and crawling into the narrow shaft, dragging the gun behind him. Outside, the cold slammed into them like a wall. Snow fell in fine sheets, wind cutting sideways. He and Ember ran, not toward the road but into the tree. They reached the edge of the frozen creek where tall pines hid their movement. Caleb crouched, pulling Ember close. The dog was panting hard but silent, eyes locked behind them. Lights moved through the trees, flashlights, 3 now. "They brought backup," Caleb muttered. Then suddenly, howls. Then suddenly, not Embers, not wolves, dogs, other trained dogs. He recognized the pattern, echo pulses, long-range location signals. Whoever these men were, they had canine units of their own. They were hunting Ember like lost property. Caleb pulled his coat tighter. They couldn't outrun them. Ember's leg couldn't take it. He needed a new plan. He looked to the creek. The ice was thick, but not clean. Cracks spread beneath the surface like spiderwebs. Still, it was their only chance. "We move across," Caleb whispered. "Then up the ridge. The ice will break their trail." Ember didn't hesitate. They stepped onto the frozen creek. Caleb moved carefully, listening to every shift of the surface. It held. Halfway across, voices shouted behind them. Flashlights swung wildly. Caleb turned, raised the shotgun and fired into the trees, not to hit, just to distract. Then he and Ember sprinted the last stretch and dove into the cover of the ridge. Bullets bit into the ice where they'd stood seconds before. They kept running. Branches clawed at Caleb's coat. Snow blinded him. Ember limped but didn't slow. Somehow they crested the top of the ridge and collapsed behind a fallen log. Silence, then tires. A truck, somewhere close, and a voice on the radio in Caleb's pocket. "Caleb, this is Emily. We're close." Red truck, headlights off. East clearing. Caleb clicked twice in reply. He scooped Ember into his arms. Not easy, not graceful, but necessary, and began moving through the brush. 5 minutes later he saw it. The truck idling in a small clearing, red paint smeared with mud. Shre. Emily jumped from the cab. "Get in, now." He threw the door open and lifted Ember inside. Emily peeled off the moment the door slammed. "What happened?" she asked. "They gassed the cabin, tried to flush us out. They had other dogs." She swore under her breath. "We've got to get to the shelter. It's built for emergency holds." Caleb nodded. "He's not safe anywhere else." Ember lay curled in the back seat, breathing shallowly. They reached the facility 20 minutes later. A gate slid open and closed behind them, steel and frost locking the world outside. Inside, warmth, fluorescent lights, equipment humming softly. Emily led them to the medical wing. "Lay him here," she said. Caleb lifted Ember onto the padded table. Emily moved fast, examining his limbs, checking his vitals, adjusting his breathing mask. "He's in shock," she said, "but no internal bleeding. We caught it in time." Caleb sat on the floor, head against the wall, hands trembling. "He didn't flinch," he whispered. "Even when the glass broke, Even when they shot at us, Emily looked up. He remembers, Caleb nodded. He's been through it before. They stayed that way for hours, Emily tending to Ember. Caleb silent. By dawn, Ember was stable, still weak, but alive. Caleb looked at him and said softly, "You're not going back to them." Emily turned. "There's more." "What?" "I pulled the access logs on the chip. Someone tried to activate his tracking beacon 3 nights ago." "Who?" "It was routed through a third-party system. Military grade, which means they're not just former program staff." Emily nodded grimly. "They're black contract, clean-up teams. They want to erase him or study him, but not save him." Caleb stood, fire returning to his eyes. "Then we don't run." Emily frowned. "What do you mean?" "We fight, we tell his story, we make them public." Emily hesitated, then nodded. "Okay, let's give him a voice." As the sun rose, casting pale gold over the snowy trees outside, Ember opened his eyes. Caleb stepped forward. "You're safe," he said. "I promise. No one takes you again." And for the first time, Ember thumped his tail. The snow came again that night, slow, steady, silent. Inside the North Ridge Wildlife Center, it was quiet except for the low rhythmic hum of the ventilators and the occasional beep of monitor. Ember lay on the padded veterinary table, bandages snug around his ribs and hind leg, a warm blanket pulled to his neck. His breathing was shallow but steady. Caleb sat beside him, elbows on his knees, hands folded beneath his chin. He hadn't slept, hadn't spoken since Emily left to file the first report and prepare a statement for the authorities. There was nothing to say. He stared at Ember's face, watching the faint flicker of breath in the dog's nostrils. Every so often Ember's paw twitched, a reflex or a dream. Caleb hoped it was the latter. The pain in his chest, tight and buried for so long, had risen like a tide and now sat just behind his ribs, unmoving. He hadn't felt this kind of fear since the fire. Not when the smoke had closed in. Not when they pulled Ash's body from the rubble. That fear had broken him once, and now it was back. He reached out slowly, placing a hand on Ember's shoulder. The fur was warm, damp from ointment, but real. Present, not a ghost. "You don't get to leave too," he whispered. Ember didn't move. Caleb swallowed hard, his voice cracking for the first time in days. "I don't care what they made you for. You're not some science project. You're not a leftover weapon or a statistic in a file folder. You're here. You found me, and I'm not letting you go." The lights above flickered once, reacting to the sudden gust of wind rattling against the clinic's walls. Emily returned an hour later with 2 thermoses and a folder tucked under her arm. She handed Caleb a cup of coffee without speaking, then pulled up a chair beside him. "Vitals have stabilized," she said quietly, "but there's internal stress from before. Old scar tissue. It's flaring up under the new injury." Caleb nodded but didn't look at her. "I've seen this before," she continued, "in animals that endured trauma but never got the time to heal. Ember's body is running on memory now, on instinct." "He can't fight forever," Caleb murmured. "No," she agreed, "but he doesn't have to fight alone." She placed the folder on the side table. I found the rest of his file. Full clearance." Caleb stared at it. He was the only dog in that program who consistently disobeyed commands to stay behind. No matter what the test, he always ran back toward danger. Back toward people. That's why they shut him down. They called it a flaw. Caleb exhaled, emotion crawling up his throat like a rope. "It wasn't a flaw," he said. "It was loyalty." Emily stood and touched his shoulder. "He's resting now, but if things turn, you'll need to decide." Caleb didn't answer. She left the room quietly. The next few hours blurred. He sat beside Ember, replaying every moment of the last few weeks. The porch, the first shared meal, the search command, the fire, the chase. And in every memory, Ember wasn't just present. He was a partner. That evening, just as the last light faded from the sky, Ember stirred, his head shifted. One eye cracked open. A soft sound escaped his throat, a sigh hoarse and raw, like it traveled from deep inside. Caleb leaned in. "Hey, easy, I'm here." Ember's gaze found him weak but steady. Caleb reached for the bowl of water beside the table and dipped a cloth into it. dabbing it gently against Ember's mouth. "Thought we lost you," he said, voice rough. "But you held on." Ember blinked once, as if in answer. "You stubborn dog," Caleb added, almost smiling. "You just can't stop running back, can you?" Ember's tail moved, barely a twitch, but it was enough. Caleb felt the tears come then. Not fast, not loud, just quiet trails down his weathered cheeks, like Thor after the first hard frost. "You don't know what you've done to me," he said, his hand still resting on Ember's back. "You made me want to try again." Ember closed his eyes, but he didn't drift away. He was still there, still listening. That night, Caleb sat with him through every hour. He read aloud from old manuals, told stories he hadn't spoken in years, about fires, lost rescues, about ash. He talked until his voice gave out, and even then he stayed silent, because presence was sometimes louder than any words. By morning the fever broke. Emily walked in and saw it in an instant, the light back in Ember's eyes, the soft lift of his ears. "He's not out of the woods," she said, checking his vitals, "but he's turned the corner." Caleb let out a breath he'd been holding for days. "You did good," Emily said gently. "I just stayed," Caleb whispered. "Sometimes. That's all anyone needs." The day passed slowly, but differently now. Caleb helped feed Ember, helped change his bandages, and when the evening sun slanted through the windows and set the room in gold, he sat down beside his companion and did something he hadn't done in years. He laughed. It wasn't loud, it wasn't long, but it was real. Ember stirred, tail brushing Caleb's boot. "I think we're finally even," Caleb said, shaking his head. Later that night, after Ember had drifted into sleep again, Emily approached with a clipboard. "They're still out there," she said. "Whoever came for him." Caleb nodded. "I figured. But I've talked to people, real people. Real people. Officials who care, and they're willing to help, but only if we go public. His story." "Exactly." Caleb looked at Ember, sleeping peacefully. "Then let's tell it." And so, for the first time, Caleb sat in front of a camera. He didn't like it. He stumbled on his words. His voice cracked when he spoke Ash's name. But he told the truth. He told them about Ember, how he came limping out of the forest, how he never barked, never begged, how he just waited, how he trusted, how he saved a broken man who thought he was past saving. By the time they finished filming, the sun had set, and the wind had returned to the windows. Caleb returned to the room, sat down next to Ember and rested a hand on his back. "You'll never be alone again," he whispered. "You're home." 2 weeks later, the world knew Ember's name. It started with a quiet upload, a short interview, just 10 minutes long. Caleb sitting stiffly in a folding chair in Emily's back office, eyes shadowed, hands folded, voice hesitant. He told the story from the beginning. A man alone, a dog limping into his life. No heroics, no theatrics. Just two broken souls crossing paths in the middle of nowhere. He didn't ask for sympathy. He didn't beg for outrage. He just told the truth. That was what made people listen. By the time the video passed its first 100,000 views, the calls started. Former firefighters, veterans, dog handlers, reporters, survivors, people who had lost something or someone and saw themselves in that cabin, in that man, in that dog. By the time the first million came, it was no longer just a story. It was a cause. The recovery center reinforced its perimeter, post 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 its perimeter. The facility became a protected site. The unidentified men never returned. Word was, someone higher up had pulled them back. Too much heat, too much attention. Whatever they'd hoped to retrieve or erase had become uncontainable. Ember was no longer a stray in the woods. He was a symbol. But Caleb didn't care about all that. He cared about the mornings again. He woke up before dawn now, not because of nightmares, but because he wanted to see the sunrise again. He'd forgotten what it looked like without smoke between it and the sky. He fed Ember breakfast slow and careful, always checking the leg even though it had healed beautifully. The limp remained, slight, barely noticeable, but it never slowed him down. He had a new harness now, custom fitted, not red but dark gray, with his name embroidered in clean black thread. And below it, a patch Caleb had sewn on himself. Rescue, retired family, active Ember wore it proudly. That spring they were invited to speak at a memorial. It was for fallen canine units, dogs who had served, saved, and sacrificed. Caleb hadn't set foot in a public venue, but when they entered that auditorium, and the crowd rose in a standing ovation before they said a single word, he didn't turn around. He stepped to the microphone, Ember at his side, and simply said, "He waited for me. Now I'll never leave him." They didn't need to say more. Afterward, people lined up not for autographs, but for moments, to kneel and scratch Ember's head, to whisper thank you, to tell Caleb their own stories, of fires, of wars, of losses and lives rebuilt around something they didn't know they could still believe in. Back at the cabin, spring softened the land. The ice cracked open in the creek. Buds crept along the bare branches. The forest was no longer something Caleb looked at with suspicion. It was home. He built a second bench next to the old one at Miller Park. Every morning they returned, just as they had that first day. Caleb brought hot coffee. Ember brought stillness. Together they watched the ducks return. The wind ripple the pond. The sky roll from blue to gold and back again. Sometimes people would walk by and recognize them. Sometimes they wouldn't. Either way, it didn't matter. Caleb wasn't waiting anymore. He was living. One afternoon, Emily visited with a padded envelope in her hands. "Came from the fire marshal's office," she said. Inside was a certificate. Simple, stark, official. Ember's name, rank, and status. EMA K9 Unit, Echo 17 status. Honorably retired adoptive guardian. Caleb Walker underneath, a handwritten note. For a dog who refused to leave the fire, and a man who refused to leave him behind. Caleb framed it and hung it above the fireplace. That night, he sat in his armchair with Ember lying at his feet. "You ever think about what happens next?" he asked, half smiling. Ember opened one eye, then closed it again. Caleb leaned back, staring at the flames. "I don't know what it'll be, but wherever it is, you're coming with me." He reached down, rested his hand on Ember's head. "You saved me," he whispered, "and I won't forget." Ember didn't move, but his tail thumped once softly against the floor. A year later, they stood at the top of a hiking trail in Colorado. Caleb wore a weathered backpack. Ember wore his harness, graying at the seams but still proud. They paused at the overlook, gazing out at the valley below, green, wild, endless. Beside the trail was a small wooden post with a metal plaque. It read, "In honor of those who returned, and those who waited, let loyalty outlive the fire." Caleb knelt and whispered, "We made it, Ash." Then he looked at Ember and smiled. Time to head home. They turned side by side and walked back down the trail. No rush, no fear, just the rhythm of steps, slow and sure. One man, one dog, and a bond not even fire could break.